Hi everyone, this is Dr. Giobbi, and we're going to take a look at erotic analysis. This is chapter 12 in your critical media studies, an introduction, the Ott and Mack text. Again, as a reminder, since you are learning these concepts from the Ott and Mack text, make sure that it's always smart to make sure that Ott and Mack textbook is included in your references whenever you do an assignment. Okay, so I'm going to try to introduce this very dense material in this chapter, and we're really looking largely at a theory, French literary theory, a continuation of someone we've studied in the past when we did rhetorical analysis, and that's Roland Barthes. And Roland Barthes wrote a famous text called The Pleasure of the Text. And in The Pleasure of the Text, he used as the model the kind of, there was a little bit of a psychological, if not, in France, psychological typically meant psychoanalytical, a psychoanalytic understanding of how we interact with media, text, that's films, commercials, ads, in a way that creates a certain kind of pleasure. And the model for this pleasure is kind of like a sexual pleasure. And so much of the kind of metaphor or analogy that Barthes is going to use in understanding the pleasure of the text is similar to how sexual pleasure takes place. There are certain transgressions in sexual pleasures. We call them taboos. Certain things that are naughty that seem for humans to be very exciting in a sexual way, and there could be certain taboos that are participated in sex that increase the excitement and the pleasure of sex and fantasy, and those taboos, those things that kind of transgress what's normally allowed or takes place normally, they can be applied to understanding literature, to understanding any type of media text, films, movies, advertisements, video games, all of these things. And that's really why your authors refer to this as erotic analysis. And erotic analysis is not a term that I'm aware of that Barthes used, but Barthes did definitely take an understanding of this kind of pleasure and jouissance and applied it to understanding how literature takes place. So this text has, this chapter has covers quite a bit of things, and I'm not going to be able to present all of it to you, but I'm going to use these slides to turn you on to some of the basic concepts. So if we look at the beginning, we see this this billboard, and this billboard really illustrates this idea. And the billboard is a piece of work, an artwork by the street artist named Banksy. And Banksy, no one really knows Banksy's identity. But if you go to New York City or other places, if you look up online, you can see Banksy's works of art. He's a graffiti artist, very famous. And his works of art are politically charged. There's some sort of political message in his work in his graffiti art. And it turns out that if you get a Banksy spray painted on the side of your place of business, or you become an instant millionaire, because these things are protected. The ones that exist, I know one's in Tribeca, one's on the Upper West Side. I've seen both of those. both by surprise, walking down the street and saying, "Oh, there's a Banksy." And often the ones that are still intact on the side of a building are usually covered with plexiglass to protect them. Some of them are removed. The walls are removed and placed in for sale or placed in galleries. He's really one of the artists that media psychologists love to investigate. Well, his work of art here, as we see this billboard, is a piece of street art by Banksy in Los Angeles depicting a drunken Mickey Mouse and a coked out Minnie Mouse partying with a skinny model on a giant billboard. The piece was named "Livin' the Dream" and is located on a billboard in front of the Directors Guild of America on Sunset Boulevard. So this was a billboard that was already in existence, and Banksy painted the Mickey Mouse characters over the top of this. And the thing that really gets us about this is transgression. The word transgression refers to an action or artistic practice that breaks with the prevailing cultural codes and conventions of society. Those codes and conventions that function to sustain the ideological status quo in a particular place and time. You'll remember what that means, that ideological status quo. That idea that movies and commercials and college classes, not this one of course, but most college classes will be taught in a way that kind of promotes the continuation of a predominant way of doing things. And that when you do something that counters that, it's called a transgression. So, for example, you may be, let's talk about a transgression in psychology. You may be accustomed to taking an academic psychology course and doing nothing but statistical analysis and experimental design. And suddenly you're in a media psychology class, and at least so far, we haven't covered anything to do with experiments and statistics. We focused on qualitative research in this textbook. It's the first half of our course. And this is maybe a transgression for you. And some of you may actually get a certain pleasure out of this, a certain joy that you're transgressing against the academic protocol of the natural science model, empiricism model of quantitative psychology that has been probably the predominant mode that has been presented to you so far. So now in this class, we transgress against this. And in this transgression, some students really get turned on by this. They say, "Oh my goodness, this is the kind of stuff I've been wanting to think about in psychology rather than running statistical measures." Okay, so that's the idea of transgression against an ideology. So the very idea of doing a humanities-based psychology, a qualitative psychology, is a certain joyous transgression. So the authors continue on page 303. When we speak of a transgression in relation to the media, many people think of high-profile acts involving the political appropriation and alteration of media icons, such as the British graffiti artist Banksy painted an image of the drunken Mickey Mouse fondling a scantily clad woman on a Los Angeles billboard in 2011. But transgressive practices are typically not so public or dramatic. Audiences engage in a wide range of transgressive behaviors every day, including the practice of oppositional reading discussed in Chapter 10, or writing of fan fiction like that which opens this chapter. Nor is transgression limited to political activists and media audiences. On occasion, even mainstream media texts possess transgressive or resistive elements. Indeed, as we will see shortly, a certain kinds of text poses strong transgressive potential. So this idea of Banksy's billboard or Banksy's art in general, is a very transgressive act. And transgressions, as we're going to see, can take place by audiences. So you will learn how to participate in transgressive pleasure. In this chapter, you will learn how to take something that's been produced by someone else, a television show or a YouTube video or a film or a piece of literature, and you will learn how to, as an audience, be a productive transgressor. But before we get to that, we are also going to look at transgressions that occur from within a text. So let's now turn to page 301. And I'm going to read under Theories of Pleasure an overview. It says, perhaps the most famous academic assault on pleasure came from the Frankfurt School scholars Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who in 1972 wrote, "Pleasure always means not to think about anything, to forget suffering even when it is shown. Basically, it is helplessness. It is flight, not, as it is asserted, flight from wretched reality, but from the last remaining thought of resistance." Now, what this means when we discuss this idea of pleasure, academics tended to stay away from. They viewed anything that had to do with kind of pleasure, and certainly pleasure that came from pop culture, as escapism. What is escapism? Escapism is this idea that we watch, television shows, or we watch or listen to certain music or read certain books to escape reality. And there's a certain joy and comfort that comes from escaping reality. One common example of this today is how popular the Andy Griffith Show has become. The Andy Griffith Show was produced in the 1960s about this fictional small town America, Mayberry. And the show is as popular now with audiences and with viewers as it was in the 1960s. But the thing to keep in mind is when you watch the show, and I encourage you, watch an episode of Andy Griffith, there's something comforting, there's something pleasurable, there's something escapist about it. It offers a vision of America that is uncomplicated, that has some clear-cut set values and morals and ethics. There's a certain comfort in knowing and trusting in the good of people, and that right will eventually win over wrong, good over evil, etc., and order out of chaos. And the interesting thing is that this show is perhaps more relevant now than it was in the 1960s, but the 1960s were a very tumultuous, chaotic social time of social upheaval, lack of trust in the government. We saw a lot of counterculture movements, and Mayberry became this kind of place of pleasure, plaisir, this place of joy where a person could get lost and escape all the chaos of the Vietnam War and the leftists, the beatnik, the intellectual leftist traditions, the beatniks, the hippies, all these countercultural, Woodstock, etc. So Mayberry in the 60s was a place of escape, was escapism. And in the 2020s, it's experiencing a revival. You can go on Amazon and watch it, or watch it on Daily Motion or something, find episodes. And you'll find that there's a certain pleasure in watching this. And in this way, academics largely dismissed any type of study of the pleasure that people got from, say, pop culture, especially Horkheimer and Adorno and the Frankfurt School. They dismissed this as drivel as a waste of time, that pleasure was simply escaping reality, and that instead we should be viewing and watching and reading texts that make us engage even more so with reality, not be comforted from running away from it, escaping from it, but from being confronted with it so that we can do things, and we're encouraged to do things to confront it even more. In music, Adorno wrote a famous essay on jazz, and he wasn't talking about the kind of jazz that Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter. He's not talking about that kind of jazz, Robert Glasper, Bill Evans. He was talking about jazz of the 30s, which was dance band, dance music, escapist movement, sing-songy kind of jazz, not the kind of jazz we have today with, bebop and post-bop and cool jazz. His criticism of jazz was that, and he wrote an essay about this, was that it's kind of like pop music, and that it's easy to digest, easy to get, lots of fun, and it doesn't make you think about anything. Now, this is very different from jazz today. So Adorno was a critic of anything that brought pleasure, that was escapism. And reading Adorno's texts, my goodness, they are very insightful, very brilliant, and very difficult to read. You don't have the same kind of pleasure that you get from listening to, your favorite pop song. So it's interesting to see that this academic look into the experience of pleasure from a media text is something that really came about in the 80s. It was something it's fairly recent. It says visual pleasure in narrative cinema. This is a film critic, feminist film critic, Laura Mulvey. In her famous essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, set out to destroy the pleasure afforded by Hollywood cinema. Initially, then, pleasure as both an audience and experience and an academic pursuit was ignored. But in the 80s, when media scholars began to attend carefully to audiences, pleasure emerged as a subject of sustained inquiry, challenging the view that pleasure is simple and uncomplicated. The media critics began to look at what this pleasure was about. How did people get pleasure? And the study of pleasure became increasingly common. Pleasure itself continued to be disparaged. Nearly universal condemnation was rooted in the widespread belief that pleasures were complicit and within a dominant ideology and therefore subjugation. In other words, watching. Let me give you an example of this. I'll be very. I don't know if this is relevant to anyone in the age group that's listening to this lecture, but there was a show on when I was younger called Friends, and I found Friends to be the most ridiculous drivel I may possibly have ever seen up until that point. I could not stand the show. I could not stand the saccharine, phony characters. This was just not my thing. But so many people, this was a wildly popular show, and so many people loved this show and took joy and pleasure in it. I saw nothing but phony, fake people in an unrealistic, unbelievable situation. And it was probably because at the moment Friends was on, I was living in Manhattan on my own and realized how ridiculous the entire situation was, including the size of their apartments and what they did for a living compared to in reality what you had to do to make the kind of money for the lifestyle that they lived. The kind of phony superficialness of the Jennifer Aniston character and how they interacted with each other. The entire thing was just a turnoff for me. So I spent very little time with it. However, many people took pleasure in watching this. For me, my criticism was that it promoted a certain false fantasy, something that kids back in Kansas and maybe even where I grew up in Pennsylvania dreamed of what it would be like to live in Manhattan with your friends. and the reality was much different than what was proposed on the television program. So keeping that in mind, that's an example of how Adorno and Horkheimer would criticize this kind of mindless fantasy program that really didn't do anything. It didn't make anyone think about anything of substance or challenge any beliefs of the Friends show. Whereas in the erotic analysis, we'd be looking exactly of why this was so pleasurable for people, why people, a certain type of audience member really took to this show and what kind of wish fulfillment it achieved for them. And I often wonder how many young people went and decided they were going to live this Friends fantasy in Manhattan and had a real reality check once they saw how much rent cost and how much groceries were and how you weren't going to be able to do that as, working in a coffee shop, etc. Okay, so let's look here. We're getting into Roland Barthes. A large part of this chapter is, again, coming from Roland Barthes. His book, The Pleasure of the Text, is a really great read, and the effort here is to become more sensitive and more aware of what media producers are doing within a text to be transgressive, to undo certain ideologies, and also what audience members, especially with the advent of YouTube and online publishing platforms, what audience members are doing to transgress the ideological mainstream and to kind of take a certain joy, a certain pleasure in playing with the media products themselves. And that's going to make better sense as we go on. So I'm going to turn to page 302, and we're going to talk about some basic Barthian principles here. If you recall, Barthes was 1975, The Pleasure of the Text. Barthes, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I want to discuss with you quickly, page 305, the difference between a writerly text and a readerly text. If you remember from last time we discussed this, a readerly text is any type of thing that, like the Friends show or like a certain movie, it's one of those which the meaning is clear cut and settled. There's not a lot of room for interpretation. It is what the story that's being told is kind of like the one that you get. You don't have to think about it. Writerly text is a movie or video game or a television show that leads a lot of ambiguity and leaves a lot to be interpreted, that you actually, as an audience member, have to figure it out yourself, and it might be completely different than what someone else gets. So your textbook authors discuss a writerly text as being the 2018 film The Shape of Water. So it leads a lot to interpretation, whereas the movie Jaws, the 1975 Jaws film, is a very readerly text. There's one message in this film. It's not really open to a lot of interpretation. It's very kind of closed rather than open. Umberto Eco, the Italian novelist and literary theorist, refers to these as open and closed text. So a closed text would be one that has a pretty straightforward, non-ambiguous storyline, such as Jaws. Whereas The Shape of Water, or if you watch any of the Fellini, like 8.5, this has a lot of openness to it, a lot of interpretation, and that's what Umberto Eco referred to as an open text. Barthes refers to this as writerly because, of course, you're writing, you're creating something as you're participating and watching it. Some people really take joy and pleasure in writerly texts rather than readerly texts. I kind of view this as psychologically. I see personality types, and there's a personality type that can be very literal, very concrete, They want to know what something is. They want to know exactly what it means and how to answer the question, the right answer. What's the right answer? And that's a very kind of readerly way of going about things, a very closed way, as Eco would call it. You might, I find other people who enjoy ambiguity, who enjoy the question more than the answer, who enjoy getting lost in the possibilities, the ambiguity of something. These individuals would probably enjoy writing an essay rather than taking a multiple choice test. And that is a certain character type is drawn to this. There's a certain satisfaction. Well, in 302, page 302, the authors talk about the pleasure of the text. The French, this is the second paragraph. French semiotician Roland Barthes made an important distinction between two types of pleasure, plaisir and jouissance. While both arise out of audience-to-text interaction, they involve very different modes of approaching or interacting with the text and thus functioning in very different ways. For Barthes, plaisir describes a comfortable and comforting pleasure that emerges from passive interaction with the text. Because plaisir is generated when audiences willingly submit to the structural invitation of the text, and such as its narrative form, its stereotypical images, or its activation of the male gaze, it works to preserve the ideological status quo, making an essentially conservative and hegemonic pleasure. So plaisir is associated with the pleasure of consumption because it accepts the text on its own terms, treating it as a finished, finalized, and ready-made product to simply be consumed, as there is nothing especially creative or productive about the role of the audience-text interaction. The American media scholar Jean Fisk argues that the resulting pleasure, plaisir, affirms the dominant ideology and subjectivity it proposes. So, for example, if you enjoy the Friends show and you don't question anything about what this is actually about, but you kind of just accept it for what it is and you take pleasure in it, in just watching it, that is called plaisir. Plaisir. Now, jouissance is the thing that's kind of like bliss, ecstasy, or even orgasm in French. Jouissance is this kind of like ecstasy. I call it bliss. And it's the same kind of bliss that takes place it's often called in an orgasm. This is where the erotic analysis comes from. There's a certain pleasure that's taken, a jouissance that's taken from a text that challenges the warm and fuzzy ideology, dominant ideology. I immediately think of any Woody Allen film. Woody Allen, throughout this chapter, when you read this, Woody Allen, you could write this chapter could have used all Woody Allen film references, because Woody Allen films are constantly challenging and playing around with these, with jouissance, with the challenging of the ideological status quo and kind of like doing things that we wish could happen. I think of the clip I sent out for fun the other week when Marshall McLuhan made an appearance in the Woody Allen film, and Woody Allen is in line. He's hearing some pompous, arrogant professor from Columbia University talk about the film they're about, the new Fellini film, and he starts quoting Marshall McLuhan, and we've all had these little fantasies of how it would be great if we could do something like Woody Allen does. He challenges the guy. He says, "Stop forcing your opinion so that everybody can hear it. You're pompous and arrogant. You know nothing about Marshall McLuhan." And the guy says, "Well, I have you know I teach a class at Columbia University on McLuhan." And Woody Allen says, "Well, I happen to have McLuhan right here." And he pulls Marshall McLuhan out from the corner, and McLuhan puts the loudmouth in his place. And there's certain transgressive jouissance that comes from that. And that's what makes a Woody Allen film so fun, because it's like thumbing your nose to what typically is being forced upon you in an ideology of a movie, a Hollywood film, which ultimately a Hollywood film typically ends in a nice little bow all tied up. Nobody's hurt at the end. Everything's great. And this is one of the things there's a certain jouissance, a certain pleasure in smacking that format upside its head. So that's an example of how within the text, the film, the Woody Allen film, within that text, there is some transgressive creative act that takes place by the writer and director, Woody Allen, and there's a jouissance, there's a joy that comes from this. In an ecstatic and disruptive pleasure, I'm continuing to read on 302, that emerges from an active engagement with a text. Instead of submitting to the text, audiences rework and remake it to serve their own needs and desires. Jouissance typically associated with the pleasure of production because the interaction of the audience and the text creates something novel and inventive in its wake. Consequently, jouissance typically functions as transgressive counter-hegemonic pleasure. Elaborating on this point, Fist explains that jouissance involves a temporary breakdown of subjectivity, a momentary release from the social order, and an evasion of ideology. So what we find, and this is also interesting as psychologists, is we find it seems there are certain people who are attracted to, say, a Woody Allen film, and others that just don't get it or don't take interest in it or don't take pleasure in it. And it's very fascinating to realize this, to understand this, and then to look at maybe the characterological needs that are fulfilled by the transgressive pleasure. To further clarify this distinction, the authors continue on Mac between plaisir and jouissance, consider the different types of pleasure that one might derive from passively watching a film and actively playing a video game. The pleasure of the former is reassurance that derives from identifying with the protagonist in the film and being led step by the story. The pleasure of a video game is interactivity, of directing and controlling the action, of losing oneself in the game. The ultimate eroticism of the text would be the video game. And perhaps this resonates with some individuals who are in this class. Maybe you're a video gamer, and you enjoy the pleasure that comes from getting lost in in a different world, and one in which maybe you feel more powerful or more successful or more volitional. You can do things that you can't do in this life, in this reality, you can do in another reality. So as the authors can make this initial distinction, I'm drawing a parallel with the readerly and writerly of Barthes that occurs on 305. I'm also looking at the open and closed and open text of Umberto Eco. Eco is an author you should probably read. The Island of the Day Before was the first book I ever read by Umberto Eco. It blew my mind when I read it. It was just out of high school, maybe even still in high school. Can't remember when it came out exactly. It was around the early 90s it came out, and it was mind-blowing to me, Umberto Eco's The Island of the Day Before. So that I thought he was just a novelist. I didn't realize that he was a literary theorist as well, that I'd be studying later in life. So, and understanding these connections between plaisir and the readerly text and jouissance in the writerly text. The authors go on to tell you about their choice media erotics, of this term media erotics, the title of this chapter. Media erotics reflects a concern with the sensuous, transgressive, and productive ways audiences interacts with texts. Okay, so we are going to move now to, we've discussed this writerly, transgressive text, and we want to, there's a term I want to turn you on to, polysemy, and this is on page 305, polysemy. Adopting language regarding polysemy, we might say that a closed and open text vary in their degree of strategic polysemy. Closed texts tend to be less polysemous, and open texts tend to be more polysemous. So polysemy refers to this. This is the word. It looks like polysemy. Polysemy. This is in paragraph 2 of page 305, and it simply means many meanings. So I wanted to bring that word to your attention because it's an important word for you to be aware of, polysemy. So the next term that you want to really look into is this idea of intertextuality. And intertextuality concerns the ways that texts gesture at or refer to other texts. And you're going to be very familiar with this once I describe this to you and we see what this means through parodic allusion, creative appropriation, and self-reflective reference. These are 3 types of intertextuality that you're all aware of. You know what these are. You just don't probably know these specific terms, and now you'll be able to use these terms intelligently and identify what it is you are seeing or hearing in music. And there's some great examples we're going to see from this. So intertextuality concerns the ways that texts gesture at or refer to other texts. In some cases, intertextual gestures are intentional, meaning that the producer of the text deliberately makes reference to another text. This mode of intertextuality might be described as strategic because it exists by design. In other cases, the references to an outside text is initiated by an audience member rather than the producer of the text. The gesture is unplanned and unintentional. The mode of intertextuality can be described as tactical. Tactical intertextuality could be as simple as someone being reminded of a favorite song by something they heard a character say on the television, even though the character did not explicitly reference that song. The intertextual gesture in this example is initiated entirely by the audience member. So that's the tactical, or the tactical. It's when it's not strategic. It wasn't placed there by the producer of the text. It's done by the audience member. So we're going to look at these 3 types of intertextuality: parodic allusion, creative appropriation, and self-reflective reference. Let's look at this parodic allusion. So parodic allusion describes a type of intertextuality in which the primary text incorporates a caricature or parody of another text. This is the common device on the television shows like The Simpsons and Norsemen, which frequently mimic or imitate well-known scenes, plot devices, and characters from other media texts. So in this episode of the Family Guy, it has this Star Wars type intro. Parodic allusion is commonly used for comedic effect or mocking or poking fun.
Declaration of my feelings for you. Elaboration on those feelings. description of how long these feelings have existed. Belief that no one else could feel the same as I. Reminiscence on the pleasant times we shared, and our relationship's perfection. Wow. Recounting of the steps that led to our love's dissolution, mostly involving my unfaithfulness and lies. Penitent admission of wrongdoing, discovery of the depth of my affection, regret over the lateness of my epiphany. Title of the song: naive expression of love, reluctance to accept that you are gone. Request to turn back time and rectify my wrongs. Repetition of the title of the song. Enumeration of my
So this as an example of the kind of like the movie trailer example I sent out a few weeks ago in the rhetorical analysis, where the lyrics themselves are a parody. It's describing what it's making fun of, a love song. By describing what happens in all love songs. And that's the parodic illusion. The next example of creative appropriation refers to a stylistic device which the primary text incorporates an actual portion or segment of another text rather than imitating or mimicking the text. The creative appropriation weaves all or parts of it into its fabric, and the inclusion of another text is usually done for artistic or creative reasons. The most obvious example would be a hip-hop music, which frequently uses samples. So when you sample like Bob James' tune, that's creative appropriation, and by taking something that's already written and placing it as the hook around the rhythmic structure of some other lyrics, that is an example of creative appropriation, and there's a certain transgression that's taking place there. So this tune, If I Ruled the World, is a 1996 hit single by Nas that features Lauryn Hill. It's based on a 1985 hit of the same name by rapper Curtis Blow. It samples the beat of Friends by Houdini. Houdini. Lauryn Hill's verse, that's funny, right? Lauryn Hill's verse borrows from Walk Right Up to the Sun by the Delphonics. So let's take a listen to this and you'll get an example of they're not letting me play it. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to play the video, but you can watch it on your own. And this is what, instead of calling this sampling, we call it creative appropriation. It's appropriating something else from the past, from another ideology, from another thing, and it's transgressing its original meaning by owning it in this new rap tune. Self-reflexive reference. One of the great, my goodness, The Simpsons is one of the great examples.
Special little guy.
Thanks, Mom.
And now you can go back to just being you instead of a one-dimensional character with a silly catchphrase.
Ay, caramba!
Idly hope.
Excellent. Excellent.
If anyone wants me, I'll be in my room. If anyone wants me, I'll be in my room.
What kind of catchphrase is that? What kind of catchphrase is that?
So this is an example of The Simpsons, of this self-reflective reference. And this is that they're making fun of a later episode of the Simpsons, later series of the Simpsons, the Symptoms. That's great. The Simpsons, in which they're making kind of referring to an earlier time, a heyday when Bart and others were so popular and so famous that there were toys and whatnot. So this is self-reflexive, meaning it's talking about itself and it's referring to something from its own history. So it's usually like an insider joke. It's an example would be the dialogue between two characters commenting on something recently happened in their own personal life. Another, you'll find all of these. I guess the champion of transgressive, parodic illusion, creative appropriation, self-reflexive reference, all these transgressive texts. This is the key to South Park. South Park is another favorite of media scholars, especially in this tradition, because South Park really has a phenomenal richness of all of these transgressive acts. And it's exactly what people take pleasure in South Park is what we might call its naughtiness. The thing that brings us pleasure is that it rejects any type of political correctness. It rejects any type of predominant ideology, and it champions this transgressive satirical act. And we find parodic illusion, creative appropriation, and self-reflective reference in all of the South Park episodes, as was the case of the Simpsons. And here's another example of self-reflective reference. This is from the movie Scream, and in this Scream film, this is a horror film that's self-referencing the horror film genre.
Here comes. Wait, here comes another.
Predictable. I knew it was gonna happen. You watch this shit over and over. Shh. I want to see breasts. I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
Not until Jamie Lee's breasts. Jamie Lee was always the virgin in horror movies. She never showed her tits. Jamie Lee was always the virgin in horror movies.
Could afford a decent pair.
What'd you say? That's why she always outsmarted the killer in the big chase scene at the end. Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. That one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. You can never have sex. For instance. No. You can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no! Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. The sin, it's an extension of the sin factor. Number 3, never, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
Get another beer, you want one?
I'll be right back. Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure. I'll be right back. See, you push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife. Push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife.
Yeah, so that's an example of self-reflexive reference. So the next concept that the authors discuss is polyphony. And it is a concept not from Barthes, but from a Russian literary scholar, Mikhail Bakhtin. And he used this term to describe the dialogic quality of some novels, and particularly in Dostoevsky. A dialogic text is one that stages an unending conversation between self and other, and thus is perpetually open and unfinished. But how is such a dialogue possible? The intertextuality is one answer, as we have seen, and polyphony is another. So polyphony, polyphony, many sounds. The latter has to do with the relation between character, narrator, and author. In a polyphonic text, the characters' voices are autonomous, meaning that they exist on the same plane or level as the narrator and have equal authority to speak. In other words, the narrator does not speak for the characters, but to and with the characters, each of whom also has a voice and is interacting dialogically both with other characters and with themselves, an internal dialogue. In Backton's words, polyphonic novel is dialogic through and through. Dialogic relationships exist amongst all elements of the novelistic structure. Ultimately, dialogue penetrates within into every word of the novel, making double-voiced. So they give the example here of Mulholland Drive, which is an incredible film, David Lynch. I don't know the film Holy Motors, so I can't comment on that. But what I would like to offer you is an example of A Christmas Story. This is a great example of polyphony in between character and narrator and text, because he's narrating from A Christmas Story. He's narrating his memories from childhood, and the main character, Ralphie, is also having his own voice as a young person, along with the older Ralphie looking back as the narrator. I can't help but to think of, I think this might be unfamiliar to many of you, but there's a text by my favorite author, American novelist John Steinbeck, 1963 text called The Winter of Our Discontent. This is a book I've read now 34 times. I read it every spring. I read The Winter of Our Discontent. I find something new in it every year. I think it's chapter 4 that suddenly this book goes from a narrator to the main character, Ethan Allen Hawley, becoming the narrator. It shifts, and something psychologically happens here. I believe that's in chapter 4 off the top of my head. I haven't looked at it since spring, but I think I remember for sure, but I might be mistaken. But there's something that shifts here, and there's an emotional shifting that takes place, almost like you get deeper into the character once the narrator, it goes from the third person to the first person. It goes from a third-person narrator to the first person, where Ethan Allen Hawley is talking directly to you with the other characters. It's very fascinating what Steinbeck did there, and I read about this years ago in a collection of essays, and unfortunately I've forgotten what that scholar had to say about this, but it's really something neat to experience and become aware of that you're not aware of when it starts off. So the next thing that this chapter talks about is the carnivalesque. And I'm going to describe carnivalesque to you a little bit through these examples. The carnivalesque came from medieval, the carnival of medieval times that happens just before Lent, and it turns everything upside down on its head. In Europeans, for example, in Switzerland, there is the carnival, and in this carnival, Fastnacht, everything is turned upside down. People of power are ridiculed and made fun of in parades. Young people roam the streets and act crazy. Everything is turned upside down, and it's a way of like letting off steam. It actually has some very important cultural consequences. I remember in the 6th grade at the public school I went to, in the 6th grade, there was something called Crazy Day. It was kind of like carnival. And Crazy Day was a day when everybody got to dress up and be crazy, do whatever you wanted, and anything went. You did. The rules were loosened. It was like a fun day to blow off steam, and it was just for the sixth graders. It was like their senior day kind of thing, and everybody couldn't wait till crazy day, till this thing in sixth grade where you got to do whatever you wanted to do and be crazy and get away with it. And I think it was a way of kind of like blowing off steam. And I think this is the same transgressive pleasure that happens when people are allowed to make jokes about things that are painful, comedy, etc., satire. So this is the carnivalesque, and we have some folk humor, ritual spectacles, comic compositions, Billingsgate. These are all ideas that come from the carnivalesque, which I'll tell you a little bit about here. Also grotesque realism. So here's some examples. Here's the classical body. This is David and the Venturian Man of Leonardo da Vinci. And that is the classic body. The grotesque body, here are examples of the grotesque body. It's these deformed kind of figures, these comical, hunched over medieval figures. And we have this in the carnivalesque. We have this in certain films. And it's a way of kind of like coming to terms with the predominant ideologies of beauty and of perfection. So the grotesque, you certainly will find examples of this. RuPaul's Drag Race is an example. The Biggest Loser is an example where there's certain... another example, of course, is South Park. And South Park will do all kind of things to accentuate these grotesqueness of the body. Another great South Park is Abjection. Abjection in South Park is the power of horror. Julia Kristeva defines abjection as what disturbs identity, systems, or order. Abjection arises from the crossing of cultural boundaries, the pollution, the defilement of social categories. By dividing the world into internal and external, the body establishes an ideal boundary for staging of the abject. So hence that in which discharge are expelled from the body, menstrual blood, spittle, sweat, urine, feces, mucus evokes disgust or revolt. For some, the frequent images of and discourses about excrement on the television show South Park may give rise to the abject. Commencing on the abject in the series, Brian Ott writes, if something can come out or go into someone's anus, it probably has on South Park. So this objection desires the very thing it casts out, like the compulsion to stare at a horrific traffic accident. The abject registers and appeals at an affective bodily level. So if you can imagine these kind of grotesque and very transgressive things that take place on South Park that makes us want to watch just because it's a spectacle of naughtiness. And then uncrown. So that is an example of uncrowning. And of course, Saturday Night Live is always doing uncrowning. And these are entertaining examples that I'm sure we can all relate to, and also now know exactly what the terminology is for describing what's taking place when we see these things. So we're running into some lengthy time here. So the next aspect of this chapter again comes from Roland Barthes' The Pleasure of the Text, and this is interpretive play, how individuals actually read and view texts. So you can study this and read about this in your textbook. It's very straightforward, the difference between cruising, drifting, and skimming. Skimming you'll be very familiar with because many of you do this in college class, getting through, skimming things, reading and picking out what you think is important. Cruising is kind of like I mentioned to you about when I watch Miami Vice. I'm not really watching it for the plot line. I'm kind of cruising it for the colors and the vibe and the phenomenology. I like the mood of the Miami Vice episodes and the music. There's something sensual about it for me. That's cruising. And drifting, you might, here I am lecturing. Drifting is when you, something I encourage you all to do, when you get lost in a text and you find that your mind went off someplace, that reading a sentence, you drifted off into, it prompted you into some reflexive thoughtfulness. This isn't losing concentration. This is where you want to go. This is the creative act. Creative people know drifting very well. People who want to be creative keep forcing themselves to concentrate on the topic so they can answer the test question. Creative people allow their minds to drift and then go back and reread and read again. So I'm going to stop the lecture here, and you can continue for the last few pages to understand the pleasure of the text in erotic analysis.